here's kind of the main takeaway of the next two lectures. Foreign policy in general is a very controversial issue in general, but especially even among those who call themselves conservatives or libertarians. So there's lots of disagreement. What I want to kind of suggest and to keep in mind over the next two lectures, and I'll be bold in the way I put this, is you should be extremely skeptical of any attempt to intervene in another society to improve that society. And I hopefully am able to provide you some way of thinking about it, some set of arguments that will support that position. So, introduction. U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy is characterized by what I call the democracy fetish, which is the use of democracy-type language to justify just about any type of intervention abroad. You've all heard politicians say things like, we need to spread democracy, we need to spread the conditions for democracy. The U.S. government supports democracy and liberty abroad. Wilson, of course, is oftentimes the person this is most associated with. But we can find lots of recent examples. George W. Bush, this is, of course, following the 9/11 interventions. So the survival of liberty in our land depends on the success of liberty in our lands. The U.S. supports it. Obama said this. It's completely bipartisan. All politicians say it. And in some sense, it's nice for them to say, because if you ever go against them, it sounds like you don't like democracy and letting people have freedom and liberty. The point I want to suggest to you is this. What if in attempting or pretending to bring these things to other society, you actually harm that society as well as your own society as well? That's a question we need to ask. That's the type of questions that economics asks. At what cost? That's always the first economics question. What does this cost? Not just in monetary terms, but in other terms as well. So what's the performance been? Well, I've looked at this. I've given well, I'll come back to that in a moment. Here's one view by two political scientists. They say 3% success rate. There's one case, this is post-World War II, so it doesn't include Germany and Japan in their sample. They say 3%. I've looked at a broader sample going all the way back to 1898 when the US occupied Cuba, and I used something called the Polity Index, which is an index of institutionalized democracy or autocracy. And what I used was the measure of present-day Iran, and so as a benchmark. And so, present day in 2008 when I wrote it. And the question I asked was, what is the success of the United States in establishing the equivalent of present-day Iran or better 5, 10, 15, and 20 years after they leave? And at best case, this includes Japan and Germany, which of course in the post-World War II period is the examples people point to all the time as success, which right off the bat should bring up skepticism. You're like, okay, you got 2 data points and it's like however many years ago, what have you done lately? If you stop saying that. In any case, it's something like 20% best case. Here's the thing. When people talk about foreign intervention, this definitely goes for politicians and policymakers, oftentimes goes for academics as well. They neglect constraints, incentives, knowledge, problems, and constraints. Don't take my word for it. Take Secretary of State or former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's word for it. This is her talking at the Council on Foreign Relations. We believe there are no limits on what's possible. In other words, we live in a purely unconstrained world. We can do whatever we put our mind to. How many times have you heard a politician say, we sent a man to the moon, therefore we can do X, and they say something grandiose like rebuild Afghanistan, right? Though that's a non sequitur. The plan for Afghanistan wasn't let's build a rocket ship and send it to the moon, right? It was we were going to export liberal democratic institutions to a society that doesn't have them. That's the end, as stated by the proponents of the intervention. Now, you might say, well, look, she's just being a politician. That's what they say. Well, again, that should make you skeptical, because either she recognizes it's not true, which makes you a liar, or she is unaware of it, which makes her incompetent. Neither of those are desirable when we are talking about spending billions, if not trillions of dollars, and we are talking about human lives, not just US citizens, but also those abroad. So here's what I want to talk about. 3 things. Knowledge constraints, incentives, and the mindset that is associated with intervening in other societies. And what I want to suggest is it's not a very good mindset if your end goal is one of freedom and liberty, which is what this seminar is about. So if you are committed to liberty, what I want to suggest is the type of people attracted to foreign interventions are the opposite of that. They don't care about liberty for other people. They have other motivations in mind. Do we know how to actually create institutions in other societies where they don't exist? This is why I was saying the last lecture is relevant. Do then they have an incentive? Even if they know, let's say you actually know exactly what to do. Do policymakers have the incentive to actually do it correctly in other societies? And as I mentioned, the type of mindset attracted to these type of interventions. Here are 6 reasons they fail. I'm sure there's many more. Here are the 6 I like given our time. I'm going to give you kind of the conceptual, then an example of each one to illustrate. Reason 1, the gap between intentions and results. Here's how lots of discussions of foreign interventions go. We want to help people, so we want to do good. All we need is the appropriate amount of resources and people in charge who come up with smart plans, and will achieve the ends. Even now, guys, because you're seeing this unravel right before your eyes with Iraq, what are people saying now about the chaos in Iraq? We left too early. If we had different people in charge and more resources, things would have been different. Now what do we need? Better planning and better resources. And if we do it this time, now we'll really get it. An alternative question might be, under what sort of circumstances do you think you can actually achieve what you say you can achieve? Why should we have any confidence at all that you can actually do this? That seems to be the relevant question. What you rarely hear about is negative unintended consequences that emerge. Let me give you a very specific example. Gaddafi in Libya, terrible guy, brutal dictator, except when he, of course, was the friend of the US government not long before they helped overthrow him. Keep that in mind. Again, should raise skepticism. Now, of course, people are talking about Iran being the US ally. Again, very odd. In any case, that's the scene. Bad guy harming citizens in Libya. That's the scene. What do? Overthrow him. Sounds like a good thing, right? Bad guy, overthrow, help Libyans. Okay, US helps enforce a no-fly zone. Gaddafi's overthrown, killed. Unseen, what's happening in Libya right now? A civil war. Why? No one said, what happens after there's no government left? Well, maybe one will magically fall from the sky that will mimic a constitutionally constrained government. Alternatively, you might say, well, maybe people will start fighting with all the guns that are laying around. Perhaps we should have at least mentioned this possibility. You might have disagreed with it, but it would have been nice to at least consider it. But it's even more than that. If you follow international events, what happened following the Libyan intervention? Well, Gaddafi wasn't the worst person in the world. He actually helped solve another humanitarian crisis. For decades, the Malian government suffered from attacks of a group of nomadic people called the Tuaregs, who attempted to overthrow them and take over the Malian government. Gaddafi stepped in, being the humanitarian he is, and said, Malian government, I'm going to help you out. Send all those guys over here. We'll take them in and give them a home. Of course, what was his self-interested motivation? He gave them nice guns, and that was his security force. The people that were perpetuating the crimes against Libyan citizens were the Tuareg rebels who he had employed as his security forces. Gaddafi gets overthrown. The Tuaregs say, uh-oh, we're going to lose. What do? Pick up their nice, shiny guns, better than the ones they had before, walk over here and attack the Malian government. What happens? The French government intervenes to squelch that rebellion because it created a new humanitarian crisis. What else happened? Well, we all know, well, maybe you don't, that there's chaos right now in Syria. Where are the weapons coming from? Of course, part of them are coming from the Russian government, but guess where else they're coming from? Libya. Because no government to enforce anything, it's chaos, with weaponry floating around. People take it, sell it to the people in Syria, and it fuels the conflict there. By itself, what I'm pointing out to you doesn't mean that we shouldn't have helped. By we, I mean the US government. It's not a stopping argument. By itself, it does not mean that we shouldn't have helped overthrow Gaddafi. All I'm suggesting to you is that a nice first step is to say, well, let's step back for a moment and think about what might happen. In other words, let's ask a very simple question, and then what? And if you can't answer that, or at least speculate, that's good reason not to intervene. And even if you can answer it, the next question is, well, let's say the worst case scenario happens. What incentives are in place for people in the international community, if you will, to respond to it? And as I'll discuss in a few moments, those incentives more often than not are going to be quite perverse. Number 2, reliance on top-down planning, which I just talked about a moment ago during the first lecture. What are interventions? How do they operate? Well, it goes something like this. Decisions are made to intervene. A group of supposed experts is convened. Those supposed experts, which typically involve military folks, academics, policymakers, come together and formulate some kind of blueprint which is then imposed on another society. The problem with this is it violates everything we just talked about. The fundamental idea is that liberal institutions, I don't mean liberal in the modern day sense, I mean it in the classic sense. Liberal institutions can be planned, when I say rationalized, can be planned and implemented as desired in other societies. What's the problem with this? They can't be. Why? The stuff we just talked about. Let me give you a very straightforward example to make this point. Do you think this would have worked in Iraq, Afghanistan, or pick any other poor society? Okay, US Constitution worked pretty well. Some would say worked pretty well for a while. Let's go to the local museum shop. We'll splurge and buy the parchment version. So we'll spend like 15 bucks. We'll roll it up and we'll mail it over to people in Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever country we want. We'll say, hey guys, worked pretty well here. Just follow these same rules and you'll get the same outcome. Do you expect that to work? Hopefully, you'll say no, because if you don't, you're wrong. The reason it won't work is why? Because they can't read? No. Why? The US Constitution worked precisely because you didn't have to write down every single rule or action that people could or couldn't do. It was an attempt to codify, in general terms, an existing set of beliefs or dispositions that allowed the formal institutions to operate in the desired manner. What happens when there's a fundamental disconnect between informal and formal rules? Think about an extreme case. No one believes in property rights, yet you write down property rights. What's going to happen? People in their daily lives are not going to follow the rules. So what are the options? The formal rules go away, or they're just there on paper but not enforced, or you need to coerce people. You stick a gun in their face and say, you follow the rules or I'll kill you or throw you in jail. Here's the thing. A free society, what you and I would consider a free society, works best where coercion is least, where you don't need a police person standing behind you, sticking a gun in your head, telling you what to do. That's the very opposite of what many people consider to be liberty, right? Yet that's what's required when there's a disconnect between these two things. This is the fundamental irony in some sense of nation building. I am going to come in with troops, stick a gun in your face, and tell you what to do in the name of freeing you, right? This is the whole I'm here to help. It's like the guy's kicking in the door and bring you democracy thing. Number 3, a complete ignorance of social and historical context. Again, don't take my word for it. Take General Stanley McChrystal, who led the troops in Afghanistan. This is him speaking on the anniversary of the Afghanistan intervention. We didn't know enough and we still don't know enough. Most of us, me included, had a superficial understanding of the situation and history in Afghanistan, and we had a frighteningly simplistic view of recent history. In other words, no one bothered to look at Wikipedia, let alone read a history book. Yet, they were quite confident intervening in a country and spending trillions of dollars in killing people, both American citizens and Afghan citizens. Now, you might say, well, it's very hard to understand the culture of another country. Okay. Well, let's do a superficial review. There's something called the Helmand Valley Project, which is one of the most infamous development projects in the history of mankind. This is well before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the late 70s. And what happened was, when Afghanistan was a peaceful country, and the US, Japanese, Germans, lots of other governments who were well-intentioned humanitarians got together and said, let's help Afghanistan develop. We are going to develop the Helmand Valley region, and we're going to send them capital goods tractors. We're going to send over technical experts to teach them how to farm. We're going to pick people up. They literally moved people, forced relocation to areas that were considered to be better farming lands. And we're going to create, you can look this up, a little America in Afghanistan. All right? So you think I'm exaggerating about this. Literally, they said we're going to recreate America in Afghanistan. We can rationalize it because we know how to do it. You can read lots of history and reports on this, but let's say you're too busy because you're planning the intervention. You can just Google and pull up a 1960 New York Times headline that talks about how it's a comedy of errors, how there's a major fault in the planning in Helmand Valley because it doesn't take in the human element, what you and I, or economists would call incentives. It talks about how The tractors, the state-of-the-art tractors that are being sent over, are sitting there rusting and not being used. Now, one hypothesis would be that Afghan citizens like being poor. You sent the tractors over and they're like, no, I reject that, I prefer poverty. An alternative would be that there's something else going on that is distorting the incentives they face. I tend to subscribe to the latter. Explanation. Number 4, the primacy of collectivism over individualism. I mentioned this in my last lecture. Foreign intervention is the new collectivism. It's the new central planning. Post-Cold War, people don't talk about centrally planning an economy anymore, unless like you're in Venezuela or something like that. For the most part, people don't talk about it. That's so 80s. We've moved on. What's the new intervention? Well-intentioned, enlightened Westerners imposing things on other people. Centrally planning global welfare. Rarely, if ever, in these discussions do you hear people talk about people as individuals. They talk about the collective. We need to fix them. There's us and them. There's a collectivist language that underpins it. Pull up any kind of development report and you'll see this type of language. We. We're people. If we care about individuals, for the sake of caring about individuals because we believe in human dignity, let's say, or if you want to make the consequentialist argument that humans need freedom in order to engage in experimentation so that they can figure out new and better ways of using resources and new and better ways of living. In either case, individuals, people, are at the core of the argument. But that's not the kind of language that permeates discussions of foreign intervention. It is collectivism. How's this one for you? Haiti, earthquake, it stinks, but here's a silver lining. We can put it back together the way we want to. As if Haitian citizens are little pawns that you can move around in a little science project the way you, the enlightened Westerner, wants to. Do you think this is a commitment to individualism and liberty or to extreme arrogance? I subscribe to the latter. Reliance on politics. And you say, well, we need to rely on politics. And I say, no, we don't. We choose to rely on politics. But it's not just politics. It is massive, bureaucratic, large-scale politics. Look up the number of government agencies, not just in the United States, but from all governments and international organizations involved in the reconstructions of Iraq and Afghanistan. It is mind-boggling. Now, how many of you have stood in line at the US Post Office? How many of you have stood in line at the DMV, Amtrak? Now, let me ask you a question. What if we multiply that by a couple thousand, give them guns and tell them to rebuild a country? What do you expect to happen? All of a sudden, magically, they have efficiency and the ability to do it, even putting aside the other issues? Or do you expect the same problems that plague putting a letter in someone's mailbox to be even worse when it comes to doing things like designing and implementing economic, legal, social, and political institutions? Why is this the case? Well, it requires you to appreciate the logic of bureaucracy. And the economics of bureaucracy in a nutshell goes something like this. If you have a for-profit business or a for-profit firm, and you are the owner, the residual claimant, let's say that you are able to effectively remove waste or make your production processing more efficient. Okay? Either one, it doesn't matter. What does that do? It increases your profit. And where does that profit go? Into your pocket, because you are the residual claimant or owner. In other words, you have an incentive to do those things. If you work for a government bureau and you are given a $5 million budget, let's say, making this up, and you accomplish your goal, whatever it is, for half of that, for $2.5 million, and you go in front of Congress at the end of the year to testify and you're asking for your new budget, and you say, I am truly a civil servant. I am a steward of taxpayer funds. I did everything I was supposed to do at half the budget. What happens to you? Does anyone know? Your budget gets cut. You get less money next year. Why? They say, great, now you can do the same thing next year with less money. Thanks a lot. In other words, you are penalized for being efficient. The exact opposite that happens in markets. This doesn't just happen in things related to foreign interventions. It happens on college campuses all the time, I assure you. Libraries want to spend down their budget at the end of the year. So they say, order books. Why? Because if they don't, they get less money next year. So they spend down the budget. There is lots of waste, but there's no incentive to minimize it. In fact, there's an incentive to spend more. Why? In political bureaus, government bureaus, the way you signal importance is absent profit and loss, because they're nonprofits by definition, the way you signal importance is by spending a lot and by making things up, by creating demand for your product. This is why no matter what government agency you see testify in front of Congress, they never say things like, yeah, we're doing pretty well. We don't need anything else. We are solving the problems. They go, no, there's this problem, this crisis, this war. There's war on everything. War on poverty, war on terror, war on drugs. We have so many wars going on, it's impossible to keep track. Why? That's the way you get more money. You expand your portfolio of activities, what we call mission creep. Again, don't take my word for it. Let's go to the videotape. Military. Lots of people say government needs to supply national defense, what economists call a public good. Very rarely, though, do people say, well, what does that mean, actually? What constitutes the public good? Who do you think would be in the best position to know what military supplies we need? Hopefully, you might say people in the military, since in principle, they have a comparative advantage in understanding threats, understanding the best way to combat those threats, and so on. So, even though it's imperfect, one way of providing national defense might be for policymakers to say, okay, decision makers in the military, please tell us what the threats are and what you need. Now that still might lead to waste, but it seems sensible. Here's an article from the Washington Post about how members of the military are telling US Congress we don't need tanks anymore. Tank warfare, done. That was World War II. We're not worried about that anymore. Fighting the war on terror doesn't require this. Why? Well, our targets dispersed. It's oftentimes in geographic regions where tanks can't go. We need things like drones or whatever. Well, guess what? They don't listen to them. Why? They're publicly spirited. They really care about us and want to provide defense to protect us. They'd never waste resources on, not when it comes to defense. We can't make that political. Well, guess what? We can. Here's why. York, Pennsylvania is the factory that refurbishes the tanks. If you are a representative from that area, what do you want? You want your constituents to vote for you. What does that mean? I will protect jobs and bring money to this district, even if it means undermining the national security for everyone else in the nation. Well, they don't say that part, but that's really what happens. It's exactly what's happening right here. A representative is willing to undermine national security. They are blatantly willing to go against the dictates of the military, of what the military wants to provide what they consider to be national defense in order to satisfy a small group of constituents who don't want to lose their jobs. That's good politics, right? Perhaps. It's not good national defense. We just spent a whole lecture talking about complex phenomena. Foreign interventions reject the very notion of complex phenomena, and they have to. The reason they have to is because they want to use human reason to design societies. In order to do that, you must reject complex phenomena. Because the minute you appreciate complex phenomena, using human reason to rebuild societies is off the table. Again, you think I'm overstating. Let me give you two examples. This is from the Army Stability Operations Manual. It's kind of like the handbook for post-conflict reconstruction. All right, let's see. You want some democracy? No problem. You just promote some civic participation, mix in some free media, build a legitimate executive, develop some political systems, promote civil society, voila. You get stable democracy. You want an economy? Got that for you too in 5 simple steps. Just build some infrastructure, a workforce, natural resources, get rid of black markets, voila. You got a developed economy. Hopefully this strikes you as patently absurd, because it is, on multiple margins. Margin 1, you can write down the list of ingredients that go into a economy or democracy in 5 steps, as if it's putting together like a child's toy. Actually, the instructions for those are a lot more complicated. Second, that it's purely a linear exercise. The opposite of a complex system is a linear type system, A plus B equals C. The arrow of causation implies a linear relationship. You do these things, and that causes this. That's far from clear. We have no theory behind this. This is absurd. It is the idea that if you just get smart enough people together, and in Microsoft PowerPoint, you can design an entire nation. All right? It's that kind of mentality. So let's talk about the interventionist mindset now. Now we got some reasons to understand why they might fail. Foreign interventions, so the use of discretionary government power to intervene in another society and fix it, attracts a certain type of person because it creates incentives that people with these characteristics will tend to be drawn towards both advocating interventions and helping to design them. And let's go through the characteristics. Number one, they're extremely confident in their ability to solve complex problems in other societies. I, over here, can fix the world's problems. In order to put something like this together, you have to be confident that you can fix Afghanistan's problems while completely ignoring history, as McChrystal did. Number two, possess a sense of extreme superiority, both in terms of scientific knowledge, I know how to build other societies, and righteousness. I am morally superior such that I am in a position to impose my view on other people. Sounds like a nice person. Number three, they condemn the preferences and lives of other people. In order to fix someone else's society, you must condemn it. Not necessarily explicitly, although that happens sometimes, but oftentimes implicitly, because you are assuming that your designed little order is somehow preferable to what people are doing, that is somehow better than what they already have, that it's what they want. They don't actually want what they have, or they can't figure it out for themselves. They need you to tell them what to do. Number four, related. They feel very comfortable imposing their preferences on others, using force when they need to. Of course, as I mentioned, that's the puzzle pieces fitting together. When there's a disjoint between those two things, the options are dysfunction or force. Number five, they're extremely confident in a massive bureaucratic public-private complex to implement their vision. Now, here's kind of the really weird part about this. Oftentimes, very strong opponents of intervention tend to fall in the conservative/Republican end of the political spectrum. If you ask these individuals, what do you think about public education? They'll say, government's terrible, they're ruining public education, they need to get out of public education, markets can provide it. What do you think about Obamacare? Terrible. Government can't manage health care. What do you think about Iraq? US government needs to intervene and fix them. I'll come back to this at the end, but there's a fundamental tension here because rebuilding an entire nation is much harder than teaching a child something. In other words, getting together in a classroom. It's much more difficult than healthcare because it's that plus lots of other things. If you buy into this and if you believe in the strength of massive bureaucracy, because military intervention spills back on all aspects of life, domestically as well, from things like the TSA to debt to other intrusions on our rights and liberty. But if you believe this, if people truly believe that government is effective at doing this, then they should not call themselves limited government folks. They should say, look, I embrace the biggest possible government. In fact, I think we should mimic the managerial style of the military and just implement it at home. If they're so good at rebuilding things abroad, let's have them run the education system here and healthcare and everything else. I imagine you'd find that repugnant. But why then are people so comfortable doing the same thing on a grand scale to other people? I'm guessing because they don't view them as other people. They view them as them. That's the collectivist mindset. Number six, they lack sympathy towards foreigners. Now this is counterintuitive because people say, no, the reason we're intervening is to help people, precisely because we are sympathetic to them. What happens when people in a country where a government intervenes fights back or rejects what they're doing? One alternative is to say they are insurgents. They must be squashed. An alternative is to say, boy, maybe they don't like us here. Perhaps this is not what they want. The typical response is the former. They are insurgents that need to be squashed. So you're not sympathetic to the option that maybe they don't want you there. What you view as desirable, perhaps they don't, for whatever reason. They might be right or wrong from your perspective, but that's their view. Number seven, they exclude costs imposed on those being intervened upon from cost-benefit discussions. Iraq, Afghanistan, when people talk about number of deaths, what do US politicians and policymakers focus on? The number of US soldiers that were killed. Never do you hear, oops, in the process we killed 600,000 to 1 million Afghan and Iraq people. That would sound pretty big all of a sudden. It's like, no, we lost several thousand soldiers. I'm not saying we discount those soldiers by any means. What I'm saying is, by doing that, you severely underestimate the cost of the intervention. Again, the implicit assumption here is us, we are all that matters. Them, they don't matter. The collateral damage isn't a true cost, it's just collateral damage that needs to be done to implement our image. our plan, excuse me. Number 8, understate the monetary cost of intervention on domestic populace. You guys probably don't remember, but when the US first intervened in Iraq, the promises that were made were not going to cost us anything because, well, it costs us a small amount of upfront money and then the oil will repay it. Iraqis will greet us as liberators and will offset the cost of the intervention. The promise was nothing. This is a costless intervention, basically. Sounds pretty nice. We're helping people, we're exporting democracy, and it doesn't cost us a penny. Oops. Now it just didn't cost us money in the past. Now we're talking about doing more now. Again, completely underestimating the monetary costs. If you understand the logic of bureaucracy, you understand why there's an inherent incentive always to overspend, which should again cast skepticism when you hear politicians doing this. As a rule of thumb, anytime a politician says something costs something, on either party, just take it and multiply it by at least 5, maybe 10. And that should be the actual cost estimate that's used. Number 9, embrace an unwavering sense of nationalism. If you say you're anti-intervention, if you say you don't like the troops being abroad, if you make any kind of negative comment about foreign intervention, more often than not, you are somehow couched as being anti-American, you don't care about the troops, you're not supportive of America. You capture this, and any time any member of the military is around, people thank them for their service, not realizing that not everyone in the military is in the middle of combat. They have chefs, they have computer programmers, right? It's like, thank you for your service. Oh, you're welcome, I programmed a computer. It was great service to the country. If you don't say things like that, or if you say, that's odd, why don't you thank me for my service, right? Or anyone else for that matter, somehow you are viewed as being anti-American. So criticism is off the table. Number 10, publicly condemn other governments from engaging in foreign interventions. The US intervenes, right, abroad. Iran says, we're going to get involved to shape the outcome. And the US government says, how dare you try to intervene? What are you thinking? Or more recently, how many saw John Kerry criticize Putin after the intervention in Ukraine? How dare you intervene abroad, right? What gives you the right? Of course, completely unaware of the irony that the US is all over the world. Why? Well, if you have a sense of superiority, of exceptionalism, that you are right and everyone else is wrong, you can see why you'd have this view. A complete lack of self-awareness in the face of failure. What do I mean by this? I mentioned this earlier. Failure occurs. What is the first thing? If you fail in life, what's the place you should start in your own life? You say, look, I need to figure out what my weaknesses are and what my limitations are and make adjustments where I can. What are my constraints? That never happens in foreign policy. And again, you're seeing that play out. It's timed perfectly with Iraq right now. What's the discussion? We need to do something to fix it. Now the argument is, it didn't work because we didn't stay long enough, or we didn't have enough troops, or whatever. There's no discussion of, well, maybe we just shouldn't intervene abroad. Maybe we're just not good at it. Why don't we put that on the table as an option? There's things we can't do as people, and we should point out those limitations. In fact, that seems like a logical starting point. Finally, they ignore the non-monetary costs of interventions on the composition and dynamics of domestic political institutions. Randolph Bourne pointed out that war is the health of the state. Bob Higgs, who spoke to you earlier, in his book Christ and Leviathan and his other writings, his key theme is that foreign interventions don't just have effects internationally, which they do. They have real effects at home. They're monetary costs, the cost of sending troops abroad, but they're also non-monetary costs in how government influences and takes over certain aspects of our lives, whether they're economic or non-economic. Here's the thing to keep in mind. What if going abroad in the name of protecting US citizens and liberty actually undermines liberty at home? That's what you need to think about. What if the use of force abroad generates the use of force at home? Not necessarily directly, but indirectly, through things like the NSA, or through other mechanisms that aren't apparent to people necessarily. That's what you need to think about. So why is this all important? It's important because the interventionist mindset ignores the two things I've tried to emphasize to you. On top of it, it's fundamentally at odds with liberalism. It is fundamentally at odds with the characteristics of what many people would consider to be at the core of a free and liberal society. Now, you still might support foreign intervention, but you should just be honest. You say, look, I think I'm smarter than people. I want to impose my preferences on them. And I'm willing to do it at gunpoint. Why do we pretend and say liberalism, freedom, democracy? By the way, that's new. For a long time, colonialism was what? Savages, smart people. We need to lift the savages out of poverty because they're too stupid to do it. That was the argument. Now it's not politically correct to say that. So what do? People sugarcoat it with nice language that's hard to argue against. What, you're against democracy and liberty abroad? Well, I am if you're killing people in the process under the name of liberty, because that doesn't seem like they're very free after you kill them. So here's what I want to suggest to you, and then we can discuss whatever it is you want to discuss. Number one, anytime foreign policy comes up, first thing, incentives, constraints, seen and unseen. A discussion of foreign policy that lacks those three things, you should dismiss. Why? Because if people aren't talking about what they know and what they don't know, if they're not admitting it, if they're not recognizing the incentives they face, and if they're not talking about the unintended consequences, even though that might be speculative, then they're not doing any kind of analysis. They're just doing stuff. So then why do you have confidence it's going to work? Precisely because people are unwilling to focus on their limitations. Number two, supposed experts are not experts at all. People get paid a lot of money, as I mentioned before, to shoot their mouth off on things they don't know about foreign policy. Number three, avoid the conservative two-step. This is what I mentioned earlier. The two-step is you are skeptical of government domestically, but when you move internationally, somehow you confer magical powers upon it, and it is unconstrained in what it can do. And what I want to suggest is it's even more constrained in what it can do. And if you believe that somehow the government is quite good at doing things abroad, then what I want to suggest is you should make those same arguments domestically, because it will generate the same wonderful benefits. I'll stop there and we can discuss whatever it is that you'd like to discuss. What was your question about the 20% you'd ask?
No, you addressed it with Germany and Japan being But I had a follow-up, if you will. I had an argument about this. This is kind of my pet issue. And this girl said, well, don't we have some sort of moral hazard or moral imperative wherein the recent Nigerian schoolgirls, we should go in there and we have the power and just help find them and also like, I didn't really know how to, I said, well, it's not constitutionally, it's declare the war, et cetera, et cetera. So like, what say you when we hear these kind of things?
What say you? That's like the Bill O'Reilly line. I like it, it's very powerful. Well, here's a couple things. Why should we worry about kidnapped girls in another nation? It's moral. Well, why not send the military to find kidnapped kids here every day that get kidnapped? There's lots of kids that get kidnapped. We're not very good at finding kidnapped kids here. It's not zero. So that's one thing. Number two is, actually, you saw how it played out, which was Michelle Obama and other people went on Twitter, took a little silly picture holding a sign up with a hashtag and a frowny face, and then started posting it. So it turns into this public relations joke the minute you introduce politics into it. And again, the idea is that, and here's the core problem, somebody talk about this with foreign aid in a few moments. Intentions do not equal results. And the thing is, and here's the difficult part, last time we talked about what kind of you asked the question actually about the rhetoric we can use. Here's the difficult spot you are in if you are skeptical of intervention. Proponents have rhetoric on their side. If girls are kidnapped, I'm like, don't you care about the girls? The little kids, you're for kids getting kidnapped? And you're like, what? That's not the relevant point. It's in an unconstrained world. If you could snap your fingers, of course you would want the kids found, just like you would want to end poverty. That doesn't mean that therefore you support every intervention. One way to rhetorically respond is, okay, you prefer saving those little girls to helping other little girls that are starving to death right now. So that's the trade-off you're willing to make, because there's scarce resources. If we send resources to find the little girls over there, we can't simultaneously help kids that are starving. So she prefers finding the 200 or 300 girls that were kidnapped compared to however many kids would starve to death. And people don't think in those terms when it comes to international stuff. They don't think about trade-offs, right? Or how many kids will suffer in the United States because those resources are spread abroad. That's the relevant issue. Julia.
What, if any, situations abroad would you advocate for foreign intervention, if any?
Yeah, so this is something, well, we were talking about this last night, so you somewhat know my answer already. Here's the problem. Economics points out the limitations of what can and can't be done. It's an issue of constraints. It does not answer the should question. That's a normative question. What should we do? So it's outside the purview of economics proper. So then it comes down to, ethics, your kind of point about, well, a moral obligation, which many people make the argument for, a majority of people, by the way, make the argument for intervention based on moral grounds, or your preference. And here's what I will say. It would take a very high barrier for me to justify a foreign intervention. And I'm not giving you a specific answer because I don't have one. This is my opinion, by the way. It's not an argument that comes out of economics because economics doesn't answer that. It would take a very high bar for me to justify intervention. The two discussions I'd be willing to have, one you brought up last night, the Cold War, even though I think that's overblown. People bring up Hitler. But again, you can make the argument that Hitler was the result of policy after World War I. But given that, you still could, people make the argument. But that, look, here's the ones I'd cut off. Anything that's since World War II, basically. We could cut those, I think, off the table pretty quickly. And we could close military bases. I'd be all for that. Those are all foreign interventions. Yes, sir.
No, I just wanted to add, I don't know if I'm going to explain myself, but like, take parents. They have good intentions and they know their kids. And even they screw up. So how, the government that doesn't know the people, and doesn't necessarily have good intentions, I mean, they're more likely to screw up, I think.
With no incentive to correct their behavior either, as you're saying.
And also, I wanted to share that as you were going along the presentation, I was thinking of Guatemala and how the U.S. Intervened in Guatemala. And I mean, I wanted to share the story that there's a CIA, like the president or something. His brother was like chief of the United Fruit Company, and there was this government in Guatemala that was taking the land that the United Fruit Company was not using. So right. They went again and intervened, and they sent like troops or whatever, and they overthrew the government. But I mean, it was they had it was
their intentions were true. Like
Yeah.
they would have double.
Yeah, right.
And also, and it finally led to the civil war in Guatemala in a way. So I don't know. I'm against intervention.
And of course, by the way, many governments associate, or at least rhetorically, capitalism with foreign intervention, by the way. And so Central Latin America, a lot of the governments there use rhetoric where they associate capitalism with foreign intervention and exploitation, right? So there is this strand of thought that capitalism is associated with exploitation, and that exploitation takes place by the US and other governments sending military troops abroad to sop up natural resources and pillage and take stuff because there's not enough stuff at home. So there's that undermining it as well. Yep.
Really quick, one last question.
Yeah, it seems as though there's a distinction between negative and positive policy. Negative policy being a policy saying you're not going to do this, we're going to prevent you from doing it, whereas a positive being we're going to compel you and try to set up incentives to get you to do some particular thing. And it seems that with interventions matters because, for instance, the issue of genocide I think is one that's pretty complicated. If you have the ability to stop a legitimate, not politically motivated, claim whack the dog type of genocide, actually have the ability to stop it, it would seem as though, absent going and trying to set up a new government in the wake of having stopped that simply standing back and bombing the crap out of the government that's massacring millions of its own people would be something that could be done if you have just a limited goal of stopping genocide. Okay, very quickly, because I know we're out of time. The key part of your story is if it could be done. Well, look, if we could end poverty, we could do it, by definition. I agree. The key question is, can we do it? So how confident are you that, number one, we know when the right time with genocide is? And if you look at genocide, it's actually complicated, more complicated than you think, because it's never, in hindsight, it's always like, if we had intervened right then, we would have stopped it. But it's never like that in real time. It never just happens then. On top of it, it's more often than not good guy and bad guy the way we think about it. It's often more complicated than that, with people killing each other on both sides. So it's a matter of which side you intervene on. On top of that, then you have the political incentives as well. On top of that, you have the unintended consequences, which I'll talk about. Those are things like the humanitarian camps that are set up, and then the people who are murdering people.
enter the camps because they're not wearing uniforms you don't know. You actually give them resources and they go out and kill more people. In that case, supposed humanitarians have actually contributed to more death. Again, none of my points mean you never, in principle, you can't make an argument for doing it. It's just really all these foreign policy issues I've become convinced come down to this. How confident are you? Pattern prediction, not a point prediction. If you try anything enough, it's going to work once in a while, right? It's true. And then you can point to it and say it worked. That's not the issue. Consistency across cases, how confident are you, given what you know about how government operates, the knowledge issues that were raised, I like the parent example that was brought up, and the incentive issues, how confident are you that on a one after another basis it can be successful? That's really how you have to argue. It's pattern versus point predictions. And I think that's the best we can do in a very complex world that's with difficult issues that you're raising. So thank you very much.